Hello, everyone. So, this is Gene Geog History, and today I want to talk about something that has been affecting the Black race a lot, especially online and even in real life, and that is diaspora wars. So, to begin with, we first have to discuss what a diaspora war is or what the diasporas are and who is a part of it before we really break it down and get into the middle of it. So, what are diaspora wars? So, obviously, in this case, I'm focusing on the African or the Black diaspora, and this is essentially in fighting between different ethnic groups of the same racial group. So, we're going to get into the different ethnic groups at some point, but they're all a part of the Black race and they're fighting amongst themselves. So racially, they are the same, but they have different ethnic pockets that makes them different despite them sharing the same race. So there are a lot of different parties in the Black diaspora if I'm solely just focusing on Black people. And obviously, if I include mixed people, the list would be a lot larger and there'd be many other parties. But just for simpler for simplicity reasons, I'm just going to focus on the overwhelmingly Black populations. And I could list them all down, but honestly, there's really only three or four main parties in this that's really going to be focused on here. So, the first party in this, it's honestly self explanatory, are continental Africans. And this is not to say it's confusing, but this is a grouping that involves several countries in it because Africa is a continent. And obviously, it's the original source for where everyone in the diaspora came from. But with Africa, not only are there different regions like West Africa, South Africa, East Africa, and North Africa, where most North Africans aren't black, so they're really not included in this, and Central Africa. Um, Most of the descendants of the diaspora are descendants of West and Central Africans, though obviously there are some from the other areas in Africa too. And what's kind of weird about grouping all of them together is that there are so many different tribes in certain countries, much less the continent. Different regions of the continent have different customs, genetic makeups, and all of that. But yeah, they're kind of grouped together in this, and because they're the original source, they kind of have a some would say that they have the superiority attitude due to it, but we're going to get more into that a bit later. The second major group in the diaspora are African Americans, or otherwise known as Black Americans, otherwise known as ADOS, which is American descendants of slavery, hopefully I got that correctly, or otherwise known as foundational Black Americans. And the thing with them is that they are the Black people who were in America before they went independent and became their own country. So people who migrated to America a generation or two ago are not foundational Black Americans. People who migrated to America in 1920 are not foundational Black Americans. You have to descend from the Black people who were in the United States before it became an official independent country. So you have to have at least 200 years of lineage in the United States to be a foundational Black American. If you do not descend from those slaves who were the Black people who were in the country before independence, you're not a foundational Black American. And the thing with Black Americans, or foundational Black Americans, is that a lot of the culture or a lot of what's promoted about Blackness and Black people tends to either be inspired from or outright comes from Black Americans, and that they tend to be the most visible group in the diaspora, or even out of the diaspora, when they think of Black people and their cultural contributions. So that's the main thing with them, and we're going to get into how they interconnect or the exact opposite with other groups in the diaspora. And the third main criteria or the main grouping of this diaspora wars are Afro Caribbean people. Obviously, the Caribbean is a geographic region that encompasses a bunch of islands and the Guyanas in South America, essentially. But this term, Afro Caribbeans, or when you're talking about Black Caribbean people, they are usually referencing Anglo and Franco Caribbean, or essentially non Hispanic Caribbean people. So, like Jamaican people, Haitian people, Trinidadian people, Guyanese people, Bayesian people, Bahamian people, that type. And I think this is the case because these regions have overwhelming Black populations, where that's not the case in the Hispanic Caribbean. We're going to talk about them soon enough. And these people are descendants of the slaves that were in the Caribbean before each of those countries became independent countries. But a lot of these Caribbean countries have huge diasporas. So when they move to the US, the UK, or Canada, they're still Afro Caribbean because their ancestors were descendants of the Black people who were in those islands before they went independent. So, like I mentioned, this also includes the diaspora, and I think in some of these countries they have larger diasporas, meaning there's more people of, let's just say, Jamaican descent, for example, that live outside of Jamaica instead of inside Jamaica. I don't know if that's actually true for Jamaica, but that's just the example that I'm using just so you can understand the point that I'm trying to reference here. And what's interesting about this is that the Caribbean encompasses so many different countries that all has their different cultures. But I think due to the diasporas and a lot of Caribbean people of these different nations living near one another in their diasporas, this kind of grouping is formed, especially when they all bring their cultures to these diasporas, and it's kind of like a melting pot of some sorts. There are other diaspora groups who are often in the diaspora wars, and the such that I want to include are Afro Latinos. So these are people from the Hispanic Caribbean, Central America, and South America. They are Latinos who are Afro, or they identify as Afro Latinos. I do have some issues with this term. I might do another video on that because initially I thought it was just for Black people who were Latino, like monoracial Black people who were Latino. But apparently that's not the case, and it's for people who have African descent. So this could include very mixed race Latinos, or even like one droppy Latinos who want to identify as Afro Latino. There's a whole bunch of issues there that I'm not going to get into right now. But for the most part, Afro Latinos or Black Latinos, they are mainly in parts like coastal Colombia, obviously Haiti, but they don't consider Haitians Latino for several reasons. But they're not Hispanic, so let's just ignore them. The Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Belize isn't Hispanic though. And apparently some places in Panama as well. But the thing is, a lot of these countries have heavily mixed mulatto populations instead of Black populations. So a lot of the quote unquote Afro Latinos are mulatto and not Black Latinos. So it's just kind of weird there. But let's just move right along. There are places like Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and some other places that do have Black populations. But when you focus specifically on the Anglo countries, most of those Black populations are either diasporic Caribbeans or diasporic continental Africans. So they aren't foundational Black Canadians, foundational Black Brits, foundational Black Aussies in that same way that foundational Black Americans or Black Americans are mainly foundational Black Americans, if that makes sense. So I really won't be discussing these countries here since they are mainly diasporic Black populations instead of being a foundational Black population. For the most part, obviously not all, but on a general point of view, that's what it is. So a lot of the context when it comes to the diaspora war really comes from the last 10 to 15 years with the rise of social media, the waves of the Black Lives Matter movements, the talk of reparations, and all that. And while that is interesting, I want to get to the root and the history of the diasporas that started long before the 2010s. If you really want to be technical, in Africa, before there was a Western world, there was always tribalism amongst several tribes, whether they're in the same country or region or within different countries or regions within Africa. So that was always something that existed, even in the ancient days. But since that includes continental Africa and that involves a lot of history with a lot of countries, we're not going to discuss much of that today. But we are going to go into the historical context when it comes to when the Western world started and how the different sectors and how they interacted. So now it is time to really get into the historical timeline and context for the diaspora wars. And while it's mostly visible online, they stem from long-standing historical tensions, misunderstandings, and power imbalances within the African diaspora that goes back centuries to the slave trade, colonialism, migration patterns, and even Pan-African movements. So pretty much we're going to go through a timeline of how the diaspora was started offline and historically. And the first action or the first timeline of this involves the transatlantic slave trade that took place from the 1500s to the 1800s. And this is the absolute root of the diaspora divisions beginning here, which makes sense because this is the time where most Africans were unwillingly dispersed to other regions. So, obviously, enslaved Africans were taken to different regions like the United States, the Caribbean, Brazil, etc., where they ended up developing their own distinct identities, cultures, languages, survival strategies, and their own ethnogenesis, essentially. So, as time went on, these regional identities became the source of both pride and division. Here's the main thing that I want to get into here, and where it really, really started. Some internal African groups, i.e., kingdoms and elites, participated in the trade, which later fed into diasporic resentments. So the rhetoric of Africans sold us here. And I decided to do something where I wanted a list of the African tribes that sold their own people into slavery to ship them to the Caribbean, South America, and North America. So I initially looked it up on Google at first, but I didn't find a list, and some of them were kind of sketchy, or I couldn't read it properly. So I asked ChatGPT what African groups sold their people to Europeans in the transatlantic slave trade. Please list your sources if possible. When it comes to stuff like this, I love having their sources listed because sometimes this could be pretty iffy, and I want primary sources to be added just to make sure that the information is accurate. Here's what I got. Here's a clearer picture. There wasn't a single quote unquote group that sold people to Europeans during the transatlantic slave trade. Instead, it was a complex web of African kingdoms, empires, confederacies, and traders that participated in various ways, capturing or purchasing captives from rival or neighbors, then selling them to European merchants. Below is a list of some of the most prominent actors, along with reliable sources. Notable African kingdoms, empires, and peoples who sold enslaved people to Europeans. Kingdom of Ruida, which is in present-day Benin, a major coastal hub in the slave trade, exporting over 1 million Africans to the Americans before closing in the 1860s. Obviously, you see Wikipedia, but you also see Talk Africana. 2. Kingdom of the Homi, Fan people, modern-day Benin. Expanded through raids to capture people for sale, controlled key coastal ports like Urida, and traded various ethnic captives, Iwi, Aja, Waida, Mina, Yoruba to Europeans. Same sources. 3. Aro Confederacy, southeastern Nigeria, Igbo region. Operated a vast trade network, 1690 to 1902. Wow, that's a very long time. That's disturbing. Exporting an estimated 850,000 enslaved people. Source, Let Africa Speak. 4. Ashanti Empire, Akan people, which is in present-day Ghana. An economically powerful and militaristic state from circa 1700, capturing people in wars and selling them in the slave trade. Sources, Modern Ghana, Encyclopedia. 5. Empire, Yoruba people, southwestern Nigeria. used its strong army to capture war captives who were then sold to European traders. Source: the Metropolitan Museum of Art. 6. Igbo people and Igbo traders, southeastern Nigeria, accounted for a significant portion of enslaved Africans to the beat of Biafra, Bani, Calabar ports. Obviously, you see the Wikipedia, Igbo people in the Atlantic slave trade, and flexpub.com, slavery in African ethnicities in the Americas. 7. Congo region, DRC, I'm assuming that's the Democratic Republic of Congo, I think, and Angola, one of the top ethnic groups sold into slavery, particularly in earlier centuries. Sources: American Slavery Reparations and Solar Spell. 8. Mbundu, Mbundu, and Ovinbundu. Please don't mind me and spare me if or when I get these pronunciations wrong. Angola, another major group taken to the Americas, especially Brazil. Same sources. 9. Mandi people, Upper Guinea. Examples being Malinke and Mandinka. Captured and sold individuals into the transatlantic trade. The same sources. 10. Gibi-speaking peoples, including Eja, Mina, Iwi, Fan, from modern-day Togo, Ghana, and Benin, acted as both captors and intermediaries in the regional trade. The same sources. 11. Wolof people, from Senegal and the Gambia, one of the more prominent groups captured and sold across the Atlantic. The same sources. 12. Chamba people, from modern-day Cameroon and Nigeria, included amongst the groups sold in significant numbers during the trade. The same sources. 13. Makua people, Mozambique, also a notable group among those taken across the Atlantic. The same sources. 14. Pambiros, Central African intermediaries, mulatto or African agents who trekked into the interior, example being Kazanji, Lunda, Kanzembi, acquiring captives for the Portuguese via fortified marketplaces. Source: Wikipedia on Pambiros. And 15. Douala people, Cameroon coast, purchased slaves from interior groups Bakwiri, Mango, Bassa, Bakoko, and sold them to Europeans. Source: Wikipedia on Douala people. Here's the quick summaries. Additional context. Over 45 different African ethnic groups were identified amongst those sold into the Americas, from the same sources in American Slavery Reparations and Solar Spell. The motives and dynamics were varied. Some groups captured rivals, some negotiated through intermediaries, many were driven by European demand, firearms, and shifting political landscapes. European depended heavily on these African players to supply captives. They did not, for the most part, conduct inland raids themselves. Okay, this is very disturbing to read. I knew it was some African tribes, but I didn't realize it was that many. And for so long, I thought, okay, maybe they sold them initially and then they moved on, but no. A lot of these tribes and kingdoms did this for hundreds and hundreds of years, almost for the entirety of the slave trade. So that's kind of hurtful to read, but yeah, it definitely makes sense why this would be the original source of the separation within the diaspora. So all that was very hard to read, and I can definitely see why tensions grew because, especially with the whole Pan-Africanism and the whole black race thing, it's like, okay, so you sold us out to not be a part of you. You forced us to go to a place we didn't want to be in, but now that we developed our own thing, you kind of want all of us to be seen as the same. I definitely do see some resentment there, but even outside of that, let's get on to the other reasons for the diaspora wars. The second reason is the cultural fragmentation that took place after slavery. So there was slavery in all the places essentially, but depending on where you went, slavery was different. So slavery in the United States was very isolated and brutally dehumanizing, where African Americans lost all direct cultural ties to Africa. And I think One of the reasons for this is because in the United States, African Americans are the minority compared to the white Europeans, or the white settlers, I should say, where the Caribbean slavery preserved slightly more African cultural remnants like music, food, and language. So there's a bit more of that. And I think that's the case because in these Caribbean countries, Black people are and were the majority there. So it's easier. But the Caribbean slavery obviously had major colonial influences based on who colonized their area, essentially. So the British Caribbean had British influences, the French Caribbean had French influences, and the Spanish Caribbean had Spanish influences. As a result of this, the Black identity diverged by region. So, the African Americans developed a culture rooted in resistance, Christianity, and civil rights structure, where the Caribbean people often emphasized resilience, independence, and post-colonial nationalism. And that's a huge thing that happened in a lot of those countries where the process wasn't very easy and they're focused on establishing themselves later. And especially because most of the Caribbean went independent long after the United States did. So that's another element where continental Africans retained ethnic and cultural identities like the Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, etc. Though some of those countries were, or some of those cultural identities were combined once they changed, i.e., the Europeans changed some of the borders to form these countries, but that's a whole nother topic for another day. But often internalized colonial European ideals and hierarchies to go along with it. So essentially, they all formed different cultures, different ethnogenesises that had very little to do with one another, especially after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. On a chronological basis, the third reason is Pan-Africanism, which took place from the late 1800s to the mid 1900s. I don't know if they're referring it to like the late 1800s to from a century point of view and the mid 1900s on a century point of view, meaning 1950s, or late 1800s, so literally like 1808, 1809 to mid 1900s, meaning like 1905, 1906. I'm assuming it's the former and not the latter, but anyways. Pan Africanism attempted to unite everyone in the African diaspora against colonialism and white supremacy. So essentially to fight for black power and to go against the people who caused all of this dissension or helped cause all of this dissension. So people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Kwame Nkrumah and others were key figures during this movement, but there were major ideological rifts. Examples being Garvey, who's Jamaican, called for African repatriation, essentially all of us moving back to Africa. But Du Bois, who's African American, criticized him for his autocratic pathology, essentially. There are also some Africans who distrusted diaspora leaders and believing that they didn't understand how things worked in Africa whatsoever, so they didn't really care for Pan Africanism to that extent. There are also other diaspora thinkers who saw Africans as very naive and complicit in colonization and the slave trade. So that brings up point number one that I mentioned. So the distrust and that talking point was brought up essentially 100 years ago, and it's being brought up again now in the present day. So when it comes to the Pan-African movement, it often struggled to reconcile cultural, class, and political differences between people in the diaspora, people within different diasporas, and continental Africans. So it's a lot of ideology and theory, but not much proper execution, and even accountability in that regard. So the fourth bullet point on our chronological point of view is the post-World War II migration and immigrant tensions. So this ranged from the 1940s to the 1980s. So remember the first point that I brought up earlier on in the video regarding Black Brits and Black Canadians? They mainly fall under this as African and Caribbean immigrants became Again, moving to the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada in large numbers. So the difference is that in the United States, there's a large African American population, and even today, most of the black people in America are black Americans. Where in the United Kingdom and in Canada, most of the black populations in those two countries are diasporic Caribbeans and diasporic Africans, meaning there are either freshly from Africa or the Caribbean or a few generations away from their ancestors migrating from those areas. So in cities like New York, London, which is in Canada, and Toronto, immigrant black populations and native born blacks, African Americans mainly in this context, though there are some older generation black British and black Canadians that do clash culturally, but this is more so of an African American thing. Immigrants that come to the United States are genuinely encouraged to distance themselves from African Americans who were seen as problematic or angry by white institutions. So they are either told this from their other ancestors, whether they're from the Caribbean or Africa, that's what their relatives are told, or they see the portrayal of African Americans on TV, and once they migrate to the country, they stick up their nose saying, I don't want to be like those black people. And a lot of them do come to America with a superiority complex, though they're all the same damn race. And some of them are told this by upper elite white people as well. So that's where some of the tension comes from. When it comes to the United Kingdom, I'm not the most familiar with this, but Caribbeans in the United Kingdom, mainly the Windrush generation, face tension with both white Brits and African immigrants. So interesting, I didn't know that. So in the United Kingdom, there's tension between African Brits and Caribbean Brits. I guess in some ways that does make sense because the Caribbean and Africa are very different, but they are both immigrants or newly migrants to a few generations off to the United Kingdom, and you think they would bond over that, but I guess not. So, some African immigrants viewed African Americans as culturally disconnected or morally corrupt, and sometimes they throw that rhetoric of, oh, you have no culture. While some African Americans see immigrants as arrogant, anti black, or unwilling to assimilate into the black struggle. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. There are some stupid people who think blackness and being black only involves struggle when there's so much other things that involves being black and blackness that doesn't relate to struggle. And there is the rhetoric that mainly Africans, but some Caribbean people believe where they state, oh, I'm not black because they associate black with black Americans. Though when you look at the history of race in the Caribbean, black or Negro was always used for black Caribbeans, and even in Africa, some versions or other versions of black Negro was used in reference to Africa well before the West was even a thing. So yeah, a lot of these come from diasporic people interacting with other groups of black people in the same population and same landmass and same area. Number 5 on this list from a chronological point of view is affirmative action and elite competition ranging from the 1970s to the 2000s. So, in the United States particularly, elite universities began recruiting more African and Caribbean immigrants and their children in place of native born black Americans. Obviously, this will cause a few issues because it kind of emboldens the mentality and the pathology that some Caribbean and African immigrants have towards African Americans about them being better than and smarter than African Americans. And this also causes some resentment where some African Americans felt like they were being replaced in programs meant to address US slavery, Jim Crow legacies, and black people for people who weren't even on the land for most of the United States' history or even during their colonial times. And with my first point, it kind of creates this ideal of Caribbeans and Africans being model minorities, especially model black minorities, which, like again, reinforce harmful stereotypes against ADOS people. This even carries onto the workplace, where immigrants were sometimes favored for being quote unquote hardworking or quote unquote less confrontational. Okay, so there's a lot of things that comes into this. Some Africans and some Caribbean people are told that when they enter the US, they have to be meek, they have to be quiet, they have to follow the rules, and yada yada yada. But you have to think about the elements that a lot of Africans and Caribbean people that do migrate to the United States tend to be on the wealthier end, at least compared to other Caribbean people on their land or other Africans in their country. So it gives them this elitism that makes them think they're better than some African Americans. And I think this goes far beyond the 2000s, but I guess this was just the time frame that was given. But it causes a lot of resentment, especially when it comes to the lack of resources that ADOS people in general already get or don't get. So to see them, or the resources that were supposed to be for them, given to people who don't even have ties to the United States would be frustrating. And now I want to get to the sixth and final bullet point before the social media diaspora wars came into play and that most people discuss. So the sixth bullet point is cultural gatekeeping and representation. So some of this definitely is in the current social media era, but some of it was also in the 90s and the 2000s. So this part is relatively modern. So when it comes to the worldwide media, when it comes to Black culture, African Americans or Black Americans dominate global Black culture, whether it's through music like R&B, hip hop, film, fashion, but this, when it comes to international audiences, is seen as the default Black experience, and that could be for good or bad. Heck, even if you include reality TV, this is seen as the default Black experience. So when you see a lot of conflict in these movies, when you hear a lot of the debauchery in some of the music, or when you see a lot of the fighting in these reality TV shows, people see this as the default Black mentality, default Black people, the default mentality and actions of Black people worldwide. And a lot of African and Caribbean people see this as an issue because they don't see themselves like that, they don't act like that. And they feel like their stories, their music, their fashions were either completely misinterpreted by everyone or completely ignored overall. So there's a lot of resentment there, which causes a lot for a lot of Africans and Caribbeans to be even stronger in their pride. And they're very vocal about it, and they're also vocal about not being like African Americans or Black Americans, which causes some of the tension. Conversely, some Black Americans were often offended by non American Black people profiting off US born cultural movements. So, things like non ADOS people getting involved in hip hop music or wanting to be the face of certain civil rights movements that started in the United States. And they do this without acknowledging the actual origin. This also kind of takes place where an African or a Caribbean or heck, even like a Black Brit or heck, sometimes even like a Black Canadian is in a film that's about the ADOS experience, or they're just in. Some people are just mad when they're in certain films at all that are about Black people. A lot of that commentary takes place there. So these dynamics predate social media, but they were largely kept in intellectual or local community conversations until online platforms amplified them and it just blew up entirely. And we're at where we are at now. So, in conclusion, it's pretty much a lot of trauma, a lot of colonialism, a lot of entitlement, a lot of cultural differences, a lot of ethnic differences, and a lot of misunderstanding as well, though there's a lot of pain too. There's so much more that I could say about this. I could talk about how there are there's infighting within there's infighting amongst Caribbean people, so like Haitians versus Jamaicans, versus Bayesians versus Guyanese people versus Trinidadian people. There's infighting amongst the diasporic people within the country. So homeland Jamaicans versus Jamaican Americans versus Jamaican Canadians versus Jamaican Brits. People from Guyana, Guyanese Americans, Guyanese Canadians, Guyanese Brits. So stuff like that. Those could be individual videos. And then there's the element of mixed race people being included in this. So obviously, there's the monoracial African Americans versus the mixed race African Americans versus the biracial African American / white American. Or you could talk about the mixed race Dominicans versus the black Dominicans. Or you could talk about the mixed race Dominicans versus the black Haitians. Or the black Haitians versus the mixed Haitians. The black Cubans versus the mixed Cubans. So many more elements I didn't even include into this video, especially with how the mainly mixed Afro Latinos also interact with the overwhelmingly black African Americans, Caribbean people, or African people. Yeah, maybe I'll delve more into these in separate videos, but this is just a basic timeline of the diaspora wars pre-social media. So as you see, a lot of it played into the current social media era, so a lot of these past instances are still relevant today. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye!